Chapter 4. We come to Nirvana by way of Samsara. It would be wonderful if we could have a moment of awakening and then never be caught by illusion or thought again. But as I've said, this isn't usually how it works. We can have a deep realization of our true nature, seeing that the mind itself is a dream and that the person we thought we were is a dream. But that doesn't necessarily mean we will never be deluded by thought again. There are certain thoughts that continue to arise. I call them Velcro thoughts. They are those spontaneous thoughts that occur in given situations that hook us. This type of thought causes an almost immediate re-identification with the thinking pattern. It could be a judging thought, a thought that makes one feel ashamed or small. It could be a thought that makes one feel angry or accusatory. The reality that certain sticky thought patterns still reoccur after awakening comes at a bit of a disappointment to many people. They may have believed that if they had a true awakening, they would never again believe thoughts that cause them to suffer. But this isn't necessarily true. It is true that the more spiritual awakening matures in us, the more we see through. There is less and less tendency to get caught by a thought. I remember someone asking one of my favourite Indian sages, Nisargadatta Maharaj, whether the egoic personality ever arose in him. He said, very casually, "Of course it does, but I see at once that it is illusion and I discard it." This was a wonderful thing to hear, that even someone of the spiritual stature of Nisargadatta was saying that there is always a possibility that an old conditioned tendency can arise. He simply recognized it as illusory at the moment of its arising, and in that seeing it was cast aside. It dissolved. Someone like Nisargadatta Maharaj, someone very mature in his spiritual awakening, can operate like that. For him, a thought pattern arose, its illusory nature was revealed immediately and spontaneously, and it dissolved very quickly. But most people don't start out that way, not even after a very profound awakening. In fact, it's not at all uncommon for some of the deepest and most contracted thought patterns to arise just after awakening. This sometimes comes as a surprise to people. Part of what happens when we awaken is that the top gets ripped off of our ability to suppress, and we find it very hard to hold anything at bay. In the aftermath of an awakening, some very powerful thought forms may arise, things we push down very deeply, that we try to keep unconscious. But now everything starts to come into the light of being. It is not at all uncommon for us to find that certain thoughts have the power to velcro us into a temporary state of identification. Freedom through inquiry. At these times, what's important is to avoid what I call spiritual bypassing, dismissing the thought, ignoring the fact that we got caught in a moment of re-identification. We often use non-dual language to this end. We tell ourselves, "Oh, that's just identification, it doesn't matter, since there's nobody to do anything anyway. Everything's happening spontaneously after all." This is a subtle yet effective way of hiding from our own experience. It allows us to avoid dealing with our continuing tendency to re-identify. What is important is to have the willingness to look at these moments of identification clearly and honestly. There are many ways to engage in self-inquiry. I found writing to be helpful to me, both before awakening and for a certain period of time afterward. I noticed myself slipping back into identification. I would go to a coffee shop with a pad of paper and a pencil, and I would start to write about it. Writing about what happened actually helped me enter into the thought pattern that had triggered the re-identification. I would define exactly which thought or belief had caught me, and what the inner world of that thought was. For example, if we do something that makes us feel silly or embarrassed, our mind might have the thought, "I shouldn't have done that," or "that was stupid of me." If you take a thought that's small, and you start to really open it, you'll see right away that thought and feeling are linked. One is actually the doorway into the other. The thought, "I shouldn't have done that," comes with a feeling, perhaps the feeling of embarrassment or anger. In this, we see the inner world view of the thought and how it pulls us into identification. It is important that we don't use this type of inquiry simply as a mental tool. If we do that, we start to understand everything on the mental level. The problem is, the mental level is often disconnected from the emotional level. We may understand something clearly in our mind, but emotionally we may still be conflicted about it. When we inquire, it is important that we are using both body and mind, both feeling and thought. We must see which thoughts generate which feelings, and which thoughts are generated from feelings. It is a cycle. A thought creates a feeling, and that feeling creates the next thought, which then creates the next feeling. When I would go to the coffee shop with a pad of paper and a pencil, I would get very specific about exactly what the thought was that caused that moment of re-identification. And I would start to write about it. I would look at how exactly that thought viewed the world. To do that, I would have to enter into how I felt. I would have to zero in on what believing that particular thought, be it condemnation or embarrassment, or what you have generated at the feeling level. Then I would enter into the feeling and allow myself to feel the feeling. The next step would be to ask myself about the belief pattern of the feeling. How does this feeling see the world? How does this feeling see self? What's the world view? What I started to see was that each thought and feeling contained a world in and of itself, a whole belief structure. Through a willingness to enter into the feeling, I discovered that the feeling had a voice. I could hear that voice in my mind, and I would discover that it had a certain specific belief and ideas. Very often, we find that beliefs and ideas contained in our thinking and feeling come from our childhood. They may come from very early memories of being embarrassed or put down or shamed or terrified or angered or saddened. If we start to investigate in a meditative way, where body and mind are linked, our inquiry can start to uncover these deep inner experiences. You can't just think about it. You can't say, "This is a thought. I know it's not true," and be done with it. I would sometimes spend hours in a coffee shop, refusing to leave until I had gotten to the bottom of one single thought pattern. I knew that if thought could hook me into re-identification, then another thought could hook me again. The more awake we become, the more re-identification hurts. It's like being pulled forcibly out of heaven, back into hell. When you feel like you're in hell, you'll do anything you can to release yourself. So I would apply this inquiry process with diligence. I would stick with it until I saw, all the way through a moment of identification. I would know that I had gotten there, when it completely released from my system. I had to revisit certain patterns of thinking, feeling, and reaction on several different occasions. Each time the process of insight would go deeper, revealing more and more. As it did, I would get down to the core of beliefs, thoughts, and feelings. What was required was a willingness to stick with the inquiry so that the illusion could be pulled up by its root. It's like weeding your yard. When I weed my yard, I'm embarrassed to say, I tend to pull out all the weeds. It's like weeding your yard. When I weed my yard, I'm embarrassed to say, I tend to pull all the weeds out by the top. My wife, on the other hand, is a little more patient. When she weeds, she pulls things out by the root. You know, she's done the weeding, because the weeds don't grow back for a few months. When I do the yard work, there are new weeds the next week. Fortunately, I didn't do that in my own inner life. In the process of inquiry I'm describing, I found myself very focused. I was willing to go very deep, all the way to the root of whichever thought was causing a painful reaction. I don't mean to imply that everybody needs to undertake a process of writing. Each of us has to find our own way. Maybe writing will help you. Maybe investigating your thought patterns in a meditative way will help you. Ultimately, what's important is to go to the heart of the thinking and feeling process. Only then can we find the illusory beliefs that are creating pain in the present moment. Most of us have had difficult moments in our lives, and in those times we've developed spontaneous coping strategies. When we are young, and an event happens that causes us more pain than we are able to face head-on, we come up with a belief that allows us to survive the situation. Maybe a child's parents are dysfunctional. It's too much for the child to face the fact that his parents are not capable of taking care of him particularly well. The knowledge is so threatening to the child's well-being that he will create a less threatening story to help him survive the situation. Instead of seeing his parents as dysfunctional, he might form a belief pattern that there is something wrong with him. At these kinds of moments, forming a belief pattern helps us cope and get through difficult times. We start this pattern in childhood, but it can continue into later life as well. When we sincerely inquire into these belief patterns, we find that they are no longer useful strategies. While they may have helped us cope with difficult situations in the past, they have outworn their usefulness. Thought itself is not a useful strategy. Telling ourselves any story about any event will always cause pain. Ultimately, any formulation we make in our minds about the past or the present will be in conflict with life as it is, with what is actually happening. When these Velcro thoughts and emotions arise, the key is to face and investigate whatever belief structures underlie them. In that moment, inquiry is your spiritual practice. To avoid this practice is to avoid your own awakening. Anything you avoid in life will come back over and over again until you're willing to face it, to look deeply into its true nature. Again, the only way to know that we've seen into the true nature of something is that the story we're telling ourselves releases. It is not only seen to be an illusion, it is felt to be an illusion. I often tell students to stick with it until it falls away. The choice is between meditative inquiry and becoming a victim. That's the choice you have, to be a victim to your own ideas and beliefs, or to feel into them until they drop away. Through inquiry, we have come to see that all beliefs are of equal value. What I think somebody should have done or shouldn't have done has no value. What they actually did is of equal value to what I think they should have done. I'm going to read that a bit again because I'm still laughing at the way I read it. Through inquiry, Through inquiry, we come to see that all beliefs are of equal value. What I think somebody should have done or shouldn't have done has no value. What they actually did is of equal value to what I think they should have done. Only when we see that our thoughts, judgments and opinions are just as true as their opposites are the polarities of thought balanced. If the opposing thought is just as true as the thought I believe, then the whole structure of thought collapses. If an opinion that is different from mine has just as much right to exist as mine does, then it's impossible to say which opinion is real or true. They're both either real or not real. When we see this, there's an internal balancing of the opposites, and thought is no longer polarized. Only when thought is balanced in this way does the dualistic structure of thinking lose its validity and start to collapse. This is not something that we see once. It is something that we see any and every time it is necessary to see it. There is no such thing as past awakening. Past awakening is past. The only thing that is relevant is the present. Am I awake to the truth right now? And not only in my mind, but in the entirety of my being? Do I actually see that the entire structure of a personal worldview and a personal self is nothing but a dream in a universal mind? This is all that is relevant. What we saw yesterday may or may not have an impact on today. If it's still alive and vital, and that's the perception from which we are seeing things, fine, we're free. If it's not, then we must come out of a denial. We must be willing to see that we are believing something, that somewhere we're grasping. That somewhere we're grasping. The willingness to not bypass illusion is very important. My teacher told me that we come to Nirvana by way of Samsara. We come to the truth, to freedom by the way of bondage. We come to see the true nature of things by seeing through the illusory nature of things. We don't come to Nirvana by avoiding Samsara. We don't come to heaven by avoiding hell or trying to sidestep it. We don't come to clarity by avoiding confusion. We don't come to freedom by avoiding that which is less than freedom. The truth is quite the opposite. Our illusions, the beliefs we hold on to, are the very doorways to our freedom. We simply have to enter through them. without grasping or pushing away. We must not believe them, but we must not run from them either. We need to see each moment of apparent bondage as an invitation to freedom. Then it becomes an act of love, an act of compassion, to stop running away. Each moment is the moment that needs to be happening. Each experience we have is the divine invitation. It may be a beautifully engraved invitation, or it may be a very fierce invitation, but each moment is the invitation. I couldn't possibly emphasize this more. The texture and the flow of our lives from moment to moment is itself what reveals freedom. Life itself shows us what we need to see through in order to be free. So, it is necessary that we don't run from life, that we actually face what's happening in an honest and sustained way. When we do this, we come to see that we truly do come to Nirvana by way of Samsara. This doesn't mean we stay stuck in Samsara. Instead, we unhook ourselves from it. We unvelcro our samsaric and illusory thoughts, and by doing so, we end up in Nirvana. Awakening reveals our already perfect inherent freedom. It also becomes the groundwork from which we develop the wherewithal, the clarity and courage to look into anything that may have the power to velcro us into pain and identification. Over time, this seeing and releasing becomes natural. It becomes spontaneous. At the beginning, it may be somewhat tedious. It may take quite a bit of time and intention, maybe even some real effort and discipline. As time goes on, however, it becomes more and more natural, more and more spontaneous. At a certain point, this seeing and releasing becomes so internalized that it's almost automatic. A thought arises, and there may be an instant of identification. Inquiry meets the thought, and it opens itself to freedom. Once this inward releasing is deeply internalized, the whole process can take a split second. That's the way awakening moves. At times we don't even know it's happening, but it is happening. Awareness is freeing itself over and over and over. And as I have said, the key is sincerity. It's the willingness to meet, sincerely and honestly, what is happening in our body and mind. That is always the doorway to freedom, a freedom that only happens now and now and now and now. That's the end of chapter 4 from Adyashanti's The End of Your World.